The federal Canadian budget came down yesterday, and we're getting reaction from various experts. So I'm going to be talking to Mike Holden from the economist for the Business Council of Alberta about his organization's critique of the budget. So welcome to the interview, Mike.
Thank you.
Now, look, your group put out a release in which you said that while you had supported the federal government's approach to, the large expenditures to support the economy and support Canadian workers, you were disappointed in this budget because, and I quote, "The budget appears to spray a lot of fiscal water, but misses many of the most important fires that will help get Canada back on a long-term path to prosperity and competitiveness." Could you explain that, please?
Yeah, sure. So the idea that the budget just sprays a lot of water in the sense that it has money for just about everything that you can think of, like every single interest group, every single business group. There's money for everything. And I think that, and so in many cases, this was money that was important and well spent. But I think that where we think it misses some of these fires are that, if we want to if we want a competitive and prosperous economy in 5-10 years from now, we really needed to see some sort of additional focus on innovation, on investment attraction, on productivity and competitiveness related issues, and on things like regulatory reform to make sure that we can build the kinds of projects that we need to achieve, not just general prosperity and competitiveness, but also the federal government's net zero targets. And so the budget was fairly silent on those quite important points.
Well, let's talk about some of those important points, because you singled out the lack of attention to carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So basically on big industries like oil and gas, and particularly the oil sands, which has very high emissions, the industry and governments are looking at capturing that and sequestering it underground. You thought it didn't receive enough attention.
Yeah, so there were two initiatives related to carbon capture in the budget. The one was the announcement of $319 million over a 7-year period for R&D, to support R&D into carbon capture. And so that, it's compared to some of the other line items in the budget, $319 million for carbon capture, which is the government's signature priority, is really a very small amount of money. And so we were disappointed to see just the extent to which that was underserved. The second component is a tax credit, and this is going to be something similar to the US 45Q. And there was some mention that the government would be coming out with something like that, but there's no details in the budget right now about what that actually might be or what it would look like, other than to say it would come in place sometime next year. So that's the missing component of it. And so we may see significant movement on carbon capture, but this budget was silent on that to this point.
I'm curious what you think of that budget in light of the recently announced federal government, federal provincial working group on carbon capture and storage. And is there any chance that once that group has finished its work and there is a more definitive strategy in place, that the government then might revisit that budget once it knows what it's actually funding?
Yeah, I do think there is. So, I mean, Alberta, the energy sector in Alberta in particular is, well, to put it this way, you can't achieve the federal government's Paris targets or its net zero ambitions without Alberta's energy sector. And that it has to be a central part of that equation. And so carbon capture is the most important way in which we can achieve some of these reductions in the short term. And so in that sense, it has to be a federal priority. And I think what concerns me a bit about this budget is the extent to which that was underplayed, the extent some of the other initiatives, climate-related initiatives, were either silent on oil and gas or glossed over it, or glossed over things like blue hydrogen. And the term blue hydrogen literally does not exist in the budget. Those are telling signs, and they're either that these are not priorities of the federal government, or they don't want to admit that they're priorities of the federal government, and in order to appease certain constituencies. And so that either of those are of some concern to us.
Well, let's talk about blue hydrogen, which is the creation of hydrogen from natural gas and then sequestering the CO2 underground in old oil and gas reservoirs. That's been a big focus of the Alberta government. But on the other hand, they announced a strategy, but they won't have a roadmap to hydrogen until 2023. Again, is this a case where the federal government isn't putting dollars into it because it really isn't clear yet what the strategy is and what will be required?
Well, I mean, it's difficult to say based on what's in the budget. I mean, there are a few specific initiatives that could ostensibly be related to blue hydrogen. There's the Net Zero Accelerator Program. There's 50% corporate tax cut for businesses that manufacture goods related to clean energy production. But blue hydrogen was specifically not mentioned within that list. I mean, they went to pains to talk about green hydrogen or hydrogen developed through the electrolysis of water, which is also green hydrogen. And so it was odd to me that they would explicitly not mention that particular point. And it's disappointing because blue hydrogen is an incredible opportunity in Alberta. If we want to achieve significant emissions reductions, this would do that. And there are two ways to do blue hydrogen, and I'm not remotely an expert on this, but you can either capture it above ground after combustion, or you can capture it beneath the ground, which is an emerging technology. And the latter is extremely, if it's not carbon neutral, is very close to being carbon neutral. And so there are significant opportunities here to take advantage of these tremendous natural resource assets that we have in the province. And there wasn't a lot of action or even lip service paid to the potential of those technologies.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Let's talk about jobs. And one of the issues that we've reported on extensively over the last 3 or 4 years is the increasing digital adoption of digital technology by oil and gas companies that displaces workers. Recently, Ernst & Young study showed that we could lose 50,000 workers by 2040, and that might even come a lot sooner. Should the federal government, or should it have put money into helping those workers retrain or some adaptation, to help them over that shift?
I think yes, they should. And so in advance of this budget, there was a lot of signaling from the federal government and some of its leaks that the Canadian economy is 300,000 jobs short of where it was pre-pandemic, and so there was a sense that this is an argument in favor of short-term economic recovery and stimulus to help get those jobs back. And on that side, I actually disagree with that way of looking at it, because it's true that we're 300,000 jobs short across the country, but we're 400 and some thousand jobs short in specific hard-hit industries: accommodation, food services, hospitality, recreation, the ones that are most affected by the pandemic. And so those jobs don't really need stimulus to come back. What they need is a vaccine to come back. And so in the short term, I think that any of this kind of jobs focus is generally misplaced. In the long term, which is what you just mentioned, it absolutely is important, for the reasons you mentioned, for technology, innovation, automation of positions, and also energy transition. I mean, there are a lot of workers in Alberta specifically that that have skills and expertise in certain areas that may not be applied in the industry that they've been working in up to this point in time. And so a transition, jobs focused on upskilling, retraining Canadians to make sure that they can have the skills they need, both the technical and the soft skills, to actually prosper and be successful in the new economy is critical to making sure that we can grow in the long term.
Any final thoughts on the budget, Mike?
Yeah, well, I mean, the big thing about the budget, aside from what I mentioned already, was the gigantic size of the deficit last year and this year, and sort of its projection going forward. And I have kind of mixed feelings about it, because on the one hand, all the pandemic spending was justified and important to make sure that we do achieve a strong recovery. And the Canadian economy has been more resilient than most people had expected. The long-term pathway to a more sustainable fiscal position is something that I'm a little concerned with. For one thing, the deficit is expected to go down to 1.1% of GDP by 2025-26. And it's still about $30 billion. And by that point in time, what concerns me is that the amount of money, the deficit will be around 30 billion, like I said, but the amount of money we'll be paying on interest payments on the debt is closer to 40, which means that we're going to be going into deficit in order to pay down the interest on our existing debt. And that's not a situation that you want to be in the long term, because it leaves us very vulnerable to high interest rates and or sudden increase in interest rates or in economic shocks. And when you're borrowing to pay your existing debt, you know, any household will tell you that that's not a strong fiscal position. So, you know, things could change between now and then. Obviously, the government's economic growth assumptions over the next 5 years are actually quite conservative. So things may end up being better than they look today. But I think that that's is a bit of a flag going forward to make sure that the money that we're spending, if we're going to deficit by this much, we need to make sure that it's focused on long-term growth and stimulating the economy in a long-term competitiveness way, in a way to be competitive in the long term. And I guess the last thing I'd say is that there was not a lot in there on the investment attraction and regulation points. And I think that, you know, we can stimulate the economy, but if companies can't get anything built in a timely manner, all of the stimulus money won't matter because the projects won't happen anyway. And so that was a big gap, I think, in this budget as well.
Mike, thank you very much for your insights. I really appreciate this.
Thank you.